Hi, Sheila. Comes Bobby. Okay, Sheila's gonna try it again. All right, so we are live whenever we want to get started.
Excellent. We need Lewis to take roll and all that.
Yeah, Sheila, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So we're ready.
All right.
You want to get started?
Me?
You are the co-chair of the committee, so yes.
And Angie's not here yet.
Okay. Who's not here?
Angie
Yeah, Angie Banks.
Banks is not here yet. So you're the co-chair, so
Okay.
you can go on and get started.
Okay, do we
Call
have
meeting.
a quorum?
We have
Yes.
enough to get started, yes.
Okay, the business committee of the public school retirement system of St. Louis comes to order. Today we're going to be discussing and listening and sharing information and obtaining information from the actuary, because he's going to give us another. We have to do something else with him later on. Okay, is the actuary here? I don't have a visual. So is the actuary ready to go?
Yeah, they are here. I'll start with the roll call though. Angela
Okay.
Banks. Christina Bennett. Lewis Cross.
Present.
Sheila Goodwin.
Present.
Shanice Johnson.
Present.
Donna Jones. Yvette Levy. Martell Mann. Bobby Richardson. Lost Bobby. Albert Sanders. And Doris Walker.
Present.
All right, so we do have 4. Looks like we had Bobby, but maybe she'll come back in. So we do have enough to get started.
All righty.
So,
The actuary,
yeah,
I'll turn it over to you.
Ready?
yeah, whenever you
All
guys are.
There we go. You see my screen okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
I don't know what's happening. Sorry, let me try again. All right, here we go.
Yep, we got it.
All right, thank you. All right, well, good afternoon. I guess it's almost evening. This is Actuarial 101 training. I guess we could say 102. It's a little deeper dive because all of you have probably been in board meetings, or at least in Shanice's case, we've gone through this training with her when she came on board. So we're hoping to dive a little deeper here into some of the concepts ahead of the board meeting that we will have in June, when we actually deliver the actual results of the January 1st, 2023 evaluation. And so we're going to cover some key concepts and terminology that we hope will help you kind of follow along in June, or at least be able to stay awake a little better in June because you learned something today. So this is what we're going to cover, just a broad overview of why we do actuarial evaluations, and then talk about the concept of assets versus liabilities and how those interplay and are meaningful. And then we're going to talk about actuarial assumptions and why those are important, and then get into what are gains and losses and what do we mean by that, and then talk about valuation results, what to look for, what they mean, kind of how we calculate valuation results. So anytime throughout the training, we invite you to ask questions. Just speak up, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end as well for questions or comments. I'm Mike Ribble. Matt Stayback's also with me. You should know us from prior board meetings, but we're the actuaries for the retirement systems and sign the valuation reports, and we'll be here in June again to deliver the results. So jumping right in, what's the purpose of the evaluation? Why do actuaries need to perform a valuation for public retirement systems like PSERS? The main purpose, we need to determine the level of employer contributions that we would say, the actuary would say we would need to cover the benefits of the plan. So when added to investment returns that we earn and the assets during the plan, what are the future contribution levels that would need to pay the benefits? We've promised benefits to participants when they retire, or if they become disabled or die, and we need to be sure there's enough money in the fund to pay for those benefits. So we do that through the actuarial evaluation, and we monitor the progress of the valuation as one. Like I said, we'll be here for January 1st, 2023 evaluation. We'll have an update on the progress of the valuation. We'll talk about things like the funded status, or we call it the funded ratio of the plan, that helps monitor the funded status. We'll talk about that later today. And then we will talk about how we calculate liabilities and how we use the assets of the plan to update that funded status, and also how we use it to determine contributions. We'll use it. We'll talk about what happened during 2022 to cause the results different, that are different than they were in the prior evaluation. We refer to those sometimes as gains and losses, and it just helps the board understand what are the risks and the challenges that the retirement system might face, because things are changing differently than we might have anticipated. Finally, we use the valuation as a baseline for the governmental accounting and annual financial reporting purposes. So that's kind of why we do it, and this is more of how we do it, and we've seen this before. We'll update this in the next evaluation, but along the outside is the census data. These are the inputs to the evaluation. We collect census data, the membership data for actives and retirees. We collect the assets as of the end of the year. So we're January 1st, 2023. We want to know where the members are. And December 31st, 2022, the day before, we collect the valuation of the assets at that date. When we apply assumptions and methods, we'll talk about those later. Those are based on experience study we performed in 2022. And then it's very important that we understand and know the plan provisions, so that we can correctly value the benefits that we're supposed to be valuing. All of those are the inputs to the valuation, and leading up to the evaluation and the results of the valuation, which are a couple key concepts there, or terminologies we'll define later. Actuarially determined employer contributions. These are the employer contribution requirements that we would recommend to uphold the value of the valuation and be sure it's fully funded. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between that and what we're actually getting, which is a statutory contribution. And then the other one is the progress of the funded status of the plan. So with that, I think Matt is going to walk through kind of the inputs to the valuation, starting with membership data.
Yeah, so as Mike mentioned, one of the inputs that go into the valuation process is the membership data. So we receive information from the PSRS staff at the beginning of the year, a snapshot of the data. Once we receive that data, we go through a data prep process where the new data is compared to previous year's data. We check within reasonable threshold. If there are any questions, we work with the PSRS staff just to reconcile the questions, make sure everything's understood for the valuation. Whenever we go through the data prep process, we also gather demographic information around the plan. So not only do we look at on an individual basis, we look at on a whole group, which we'll see here shortly, around like actives, vested terms, people receiving benefits, and we provide those summaries in the valuation reports, not only for us to check the data, but also for the board and staff to know that we're using the correct membership information. Also, that information can be seen, like we can look at active headcounts, payroll, benefit amounts to see if they increase or decrease more than we expected, and how that affected the liabilities, because anytime there's an unexpected change, we want to make sure we understand the reasoning behind it. Mike's going to get into that a little bit later around gains and losses. Now, jumping to slide 10, this is one more slide, Mike. This is a breakdown of some of the demographic information. So you have your active participants. Those are the people who are currently working at the schools, who are accruing additional years of service each year. We look each year at their age in service just to make sure there's no significant changes than what we expected. And another one we really like to keep an eye on is covered payroll. If there's ever an instance where the payroll increase is higher than we expected, the liabilities would increase alongside with it. The next group is the vested termination participants. Those participants who were previously active members worked there long enough where they have a vested benefit, but they are now waiting to commence their benefit in the future. They may not be eligible, or they're just not ready to commence. The third one is non-vested terminated members. Those people previously worked at the schools, but were not vested, so they are due a refund of contributions. And then the last one is participants currently receiving. So your retirees, beneficiaries, survivors. So we look at the average age, counts, and monthly benefit, or if there are instances where the benefit increase is higher than we expected, it could drive up the liabilities as well. The next input item into the valuation is your benefit provisions. That's how those benefits are calculated. So there's an example off to the side for your reference. I'm not going to go through the exact example, but the benefit provisions are in the back of the report. I'm going to highlight the main ones here. The big one is, how is your benefit calculated? You have a multiplier, say 2%. You take that times your years of credited service times your final average monthly earnings. So the final average monthly earnings is your highest 3 consecutive years over the last 10 years of service. Now that's your benefit that you receive at no retirement date eligibility. No retirement date eligibility means age 65 or rule of 80. So rule of 80 is your age plus service. If it's greater than rule of 80, you receive an unreduced benefit. Now there are instances where participants would want to commence early, so they have the ability at age 60 and 5, so we have to take that into account as well. There are different optional forms that a participant, so whether they want to elect an option just on their lifetime, or also take into account the beneficiary if the beneficiary outlives them, where they receive a benefit as well. Jumping to slide 13, we do summarize the information in the back of the report. It is required under the standards of practice. This is a summary. It doesn't provide every single little detail line up exactly to the ordinance and plan documents, but it is important to review the summary of the benefit provisions, as well as like the asset data and the membership data. And if anything is out of line, or if you have any questions, please speak up. I think I'm going to pass it back to Mike to jump into assets and liabilities.
Okay, this is where we're going to start more, kind of the stuff we wouldn't cover in the evaluations. It's a little more broad understanding. So it's important to understand the assets and liabilities of the plan. I think most of you, staff and board members, most people we come across understand assets fairly well. It's like a bank account. It's typically easier to understand because it's the money that we have set aside to pay for the retirement benefits and other benefits from the plan. What's a little more difficult concept is the liabilities. So we'll spend a little more time on that. This is where the actuary really plays a key role because we are there to determine what the liabilities of the plan are based on all the inputs that we talked about. We calculate, basically the liability is a calculation of how much is the value in today's dollar expected to be paid out of the assets in the future. So really to get a key full understanding of the equation is to understand both the assets and liabilities. You can see on the right side, we use, and we'll define these later, but we use the assets and the liabilities to determine funded status. And we use the assets and liabilities and any difference between the assets and liabilities to determine what employer contributions we're going to need. So that's why it's important as board members to understand kind of both sides of the equation and how they play off of each other. This is another way to look at why it's important to understand both sides. This triangle is a scale, and that this is so it must balance, right? If it would come out of balance, then we're not headed towards full funding, basically. So the left side is more the asset side. This is the source of the funds. When the plan began, there were no assets set aside, but there were member contributions based on their percent of payroll put in, and then employer contributions. And then after the first year, those earned some investment earnings, and they've accumulated all this time until we'll get to a point in time at January 1st, 2023, we have the cumulative value of all the contributions and investments earnings that have been put into the plan, and that is what we call the assets, the market value of assets of the plan at the valuation date. So that kind of those assets have to, in the long term, have to be reconcile with the liabilities. The right side is more liabilities, and these are the payments that are to be made from those funds. So in the long term, they have to balance, or you'll run out of money or have too much money. The liability side payments are the benefit payments. We talked about retirement payments. There's also disability and death payments, and then expenses of the plan. Typically, these are the administrative expenses of the plan. So any questions about kind of how those things have to balance? We'll talk about how they play as far as assets over liabilities and funded status and how we determine the contributions. But are there any questions about that concept?
I have one. I have a question, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
You said that when you calculate the amount of the retirement, it's the highest 3 years. No, 10 years. The last 10 years and the highest 3 years of those last 10 years. Is that correct? Is that for everyone?
It's the highest 3 out of the last 10 years, Matt.
Highest 3 consecutive of the last 10.
3 consecutive.
Right.
Okay, out of the last 10. So if in fact someone were to have to retire on disability early, and they don't make that threshold of so it'd be the last 10 irrespective. So what happens if they don't have but 7 years in the system and they're vested at 5 and they have to? Is there a different calculation for, say, someone who's on a disabled situation?
Yeah, there's definitely different calculation, but I think as long as they had at least 3 years. But typically in the disability plan, I would have to look up your provisions because this is very little used in our evaluations. But okay. Typically we would assume that they would maintain that same level that they had when they became disabled, so that the last 3 before they actually retire, they move from a disability status to retirement status. Mm-hmm. Those last 3 are flat, basically. So they even though they weren't getting, well, they are getting paid through disability, but usually the earnings are assumed to be flat during their period of disability. But we'd have to get back to dig deep in your plan provisions to see how it works. I don't know if Matt knows off the top of his head.
Okay, I'd like to know that,
Okay.
because I get a lot of calls, as Sue knows, and I don't ever give them any information, but I still like to know exactly, the inner workings of it. But I can chat with you all at a later time on that.
Yeah, we'll shoot a note with a summary of how it works.
Okay.
Yeah, and if there's any instances where you receive an email around a question of benefit, you can shoot it Mike and I's way, and we can get back to you on that.
Sounds good.
Excellent.
So jumping into assets now, I know Mike talked a little bit about it. For the valuation, we receive assets as of 12/31, and it's not just a single number. Yes, we receive the market value of assets as of 12/31, but we also receive a summary of transactions throughout the year. So Mike talked about contributions, investment returns, eventually have to equal those benefit payments and expenses to pay off those liabilities in the future. So you want that investment income contributions to continuing to fund those liabilities over time. Now, when we receive the assets, we do a reasonability check for internal consistencies. We calculate the contributions, and we see if we can compare to what the plan contributed based on what we expected. We also will provide an expected return on the assets. It may not exactly line up to the investment consultants just because it's a simplified approach, but those are a few things that we look at. Now, jumping to the next slide, we receive the asset information on a market value basis, but when we go to the valuation, we use a different method, and it's called an actual value of asset method, where we smooth gains and losses over a 5-year period. The reason that we don't use the market value of assets is due to volatility. And looking at the market in 2022, it's a great example of why we don't use market value of assets. Now, not only your plan, but a lot of other plans have seen a hard hit on assets as a result of the returns in 22, where you could, if they would be on a market value basis, their funding status could significantly decrease and their contributions are going to increase as a result of that. Now, the actual value of assets is going to limit that volatility. For example, if the plan this past year saw $100,000 or $100 million loss on assets, we're only going to recognize 20 million of that and going to defer the rest of that. By doing that, it limits the volatility of the contributions and the funding status of the plan, where 1 year you're not seeing your funding status decrease significantly and your contributions spike, and vice versa, or vice versa. The reason we use this and we adopted this previously in our experience study is for those reasons, to limit that volatility. It also reflects the investment activity, and it's easy to understand not only to the board, and but it's also accessible by accountants. Looking at slide 20, this is what you'll see in the valuation results this upcoming year. I'm not going to exactly walk through this exact calculation here because we're going to build on it starting this year. Last year, we reset the actual value of assets equal to the market value. So there was really no smoothing done last year, but this upcoming year, we are going to, whatever the loss was over 2022, we are going to smooth it. And when we provide those valuation results, we are going to provide some additional training to the board to understand how we get to this actual value of asset calculation that we use in the report. So once we get done with the assets, you have the other side of the valuation where we calculate the liabilities, which Mike's going to discuss here.
Okay, great. So talk a little bit about a liability. It's basically the value in today's dollar of what the future expected benefit payments to be paid out of the plan are. One of the key concepts is a present value of future benefits. And this is the present value of all future benefits that are possible amounts to be paid out of the pension plan. I keep saying retirement, death, disability. And we don't know those amounts right now, especially for active members that are still working, because we don't know how long they're going to work, what their salary is going to be while they're working, when they elect to retire or start their benefit, if they elect a form of payment. And then once they do start, once we know all those things and they become retirees, we don't know how long they're going to live or how long their spouse or beneficiary may live. So it's complicated, but we'll try to do a simple example to give you an idea. So in our first simple example, this person is Ted, is 64 years old, and let's just say he is going to receive $100 every year while he's alive, and he elects to start at age 65, I guess it's in 2023, and we know he's going to die in 70, at age 70. So his future benefits are $100, $100, $100, $100. So $500. That's not exactly in today's dollars because we would discount those back to a point in time. But the point is, in this example, if we knew all those things, we would say the liability was $500 roughly. But of course, we don't know all those things. So I'll give you an example, another example why it can drastically differ. If instead, he had stayed longer or received more pay than we had expected, and his benefit was $200 a month rather than $100. He delays his payment till 66, but he stays until he lives until 76, so he lives a little bit longer. Then all of those changes above would change that $500 amount to $2,000. That's a 300% increase. Of course, we wouldn't expect to have that drastic of a change when we combine all of our data, but just as one example of one person that we can expect one thing to happen and that it gets a completely different result. So basically the present value future benefits is every possible benefit amount and payment data and assumptions that we can make about start dates and how long they're going to live. Every combination of that is added up across all possibilities. Every possibility adjusted for the probability that's going to be paid and what the present value in today's dollars is. And we add all those possibilities up to get the present value of future benefits. But it's going to be a little easier to see here. If you think each of these slices of pie, starting at the top and going counter or clockwise, yeah, that's the way a clock moves, right? Clockwise, for each year of service, right? In the first year of service, second year of service, all these years of service, that the members working, they're accruing benefits until they retire. And what this represents is, we want to get to another point of the concept is, if they work, say, I think it was 18 years here, if they have currently 18 years at the valuation date, the value of those 18 years of service, what they've accrued to date, is called their accrued liability. So we may expect that they work the full, whatever this is, 30 years, but this is the value of the first 18 years. Is called, this piece of the pie is what we call the accrued liability. It's what they've earned to date, and it's the liability for what they've earned to date. The next piece of the puzzle is, what are they going to earn during 2023? We're sitting at 1/1/23, and this person's earned 18 years of service. They're going to get another year of service, maybe a pay increase, we've assumed. So that piece of the pie is called the normal cost. So when we think about the normal cost, it's the value of the additional year of service that we expect the active member to stay next year and work and earn. The value of that is called the normal cost. So we have to fund that every year, that piece of the pie. The last piece of the pie is a little more complicated to understand, but it's basically, if we were to project out to retirement, the full value of all the benefits that we expect the member to earn during participant, they're going to earn future years. So this is years 1 through 18 or whatever. This is the year 19. This is the rest of I guess it's the last 8 years of their service. We expect them to accrue a full benefit and retire. This is called the present value of future normal costs, because we know we're gonna have to pay 1 year. If they stay till retirement, we're gonna have to pay every year. We're gonna have to pay a new normal cost for this person. So a couple of key concepts is just the normal cost is something we have to pay ongoing, and the accrued liability is what they've earned to date. And we were hoping that we had set aside assets for that. So we'll talk about funded status, and we measure what's the value of the accrued liability versus how much assets we have. And if we have differences, it's maybe like an unfunded accrued liability. Kind of went off the charts there, but were there any questions about that? Does that make some sense? Okay. I think I wasn't going to cover this much, but it's basically a depiction of your plan, and it's a pretty mature plan. So there's a lot of accrued benefit and a little bit of future normal cost to be had. I think we're going to jump ahead to actuarial assumption. So this is basically the concept I was talking about. We don't know all the different combinations that might occur. And so I think, Matt, you're walking us through this.
Yeah. So as Mike said, we have to come up with a sense of future benefit payments, the probability of them happening. But as of the valuation date, there are a few things that we know from a demographic and economic standpoint, whether we have to make assumptions past the valuation date based on information provided from the plan and historical information. We did recently go through an experience study. It's important to go through an experience study every 5 years. It just helps limit the risk to the plan of having those assumptions as close to what we expect as possible. As of evaluation date, from a demographic standpoint, we'll know someone's age, gender, service, occupation as an example. So for someone that is age of 45, that's information that we know. Now, he's obviously not able to commence his benefit yet, so we have to come up with assumptions when he might retire. Could he decease prior to retiring, or is he going to receive a benefit for 5 years and then decease? Is he going to become disabled, or is he going to terminate and commence his benefit in the future? So we have to come up with all these different assumptions of when he could possibly retire his benefit or terminate it, as an example. So for him, say for example that he's age 45 currently, what is the probability that he is going to retire at age 60, 61, 62, and what is his benefit going to be? Or is he going to terminate at age 50, example, and wait to commence his benefit in 60? There's all these different possible outcomes of when his benefit could be calculated from, and that's how we get that present value future benefits. From an economic standpoint, if we want to jump to the next slide, for salary increases, for example, very similar. Whenever as of the valuation date, we have participants' historical earnings. But what is their earnings going to be when we want to calculate their benefit when they're age 60, 61, 62? We have to come up with an assumption, and that's what we did during the experience study. We looked at future expectations, historical trends from the plan, and came up with the assumption of what their benefit or what their benefit could be 15 years down the road. And as we saw in the plan provisions, in order to calculate the benefit, you have to come up with you use your salary on high 3 in the past 10 years, or high 3 consecutive in the past 10 years. So we use that salary assumption to project salary out until the retirement date. Another thing that we know from an economic assumption standpoint is some details, if we want to jump to slide 33, Mike, is the plan's market value of assets, the investment policy, and we take that information that we know as the valuation date. We consulted with the investment consultant during the experience study to come up with a reasonable expected return on assets moving forward. This is the most important assumption to the plan. It affects the liability the most out of all the assumptions, just due to the sensitivity. So we look at all this information that we do know. We come up with an assumption moving forward. We don't anticipate the plan to earn exactly 7% each year, but we do anticipate that it is a reasonable estimate of what the plan could achieve over a 20-30 year period. So we come up with the assumption of 7% based on the board's approval through the investment consultant advice. part of the investment return, we have inflation tied into it in the real rate of return. Now, going to slide 34, this is just a quick summary of some of the assumptions that are to the plan. A full breakdown of the assumptions and methods can be found in the valuation report. It is important to look at the assumptions and methods just to see if there are any questions, and if so, Mike and I are always happy to answer any questions. So I think I'm going to pass it back to Mike here, because with assumptions, we have those what we anticipate to be compared to actual. So if there are instances where salary is higher than we anticipated, there is going to be a gain and loss, and Mike's going to discuss how a gain and loss occurs.
Okay.
Yeah, Matt pretty much covered this pretty well, but this is the demographic assumptions and economic. These are the key ones that we make assumptions about. And each year when we collect evaluation or data from evaluation, we find out, we had 58 retirements in this category and 10 deaths from retirees or whatever the case may be. And that's what we call experience of the plan. We get one more year of experience for a plan, but we don't have a crystal ball. These are just assumptions from an experience study. We hope that they're good assumptions in the long term, but in any given year, we can have pretty much high fluctuation. So we will never probably come in here and match exactly the experience that we expected. We don't have a crystal ball, and they're very complicated assumptions. And so we're always going to have what we call gains or losses. A gain is basically a good guy, and a loss a bad guy. Differences that create an actual gain, Matt gave an example, or where we have better than expected outcome. If we have fewer or more, sometimes it's counterintuitive, right? We have more terminations, say, of employment prior to retirement eligibility. They earn less benefits in the plan. It's actually a gain for the system. So it may not be good for the employer that they terminated, but for the retirement system, it decreases their liability because we expected them to retire.
Mm-hmm.
Worse than expected outcomes are also counterintuitive. Maybe people are living longer. That's a better than expected outcome for human for the human race, I guess. But it's worse than expected for the retirement system. Because we end up paying them longer than we expected. Maybe we didn't set enough funds aside to do that. So anyway, hopefully with the experience studies, we can manage the volatility and we don't destroy the budgets. Because we maintain on track. If we have bad assumptions, we're going to see more fluctuation, and it's going to be a lot more to explain when we meet with you in June. This is just two quick examples of how we measure the gains and loss on an asset basis. We take the beginning of year value, and we have our contributions and benefit payments, and we make adjustments, and we take an expected return, and we compare that, and any difference between what we actually earned versus what we were expecting return. In this case, it was a gain, and when we meet in June, due to the bad market conditions in 2020, we expect this to be a pretty significant loss on assets. And we do the same thing on the liability side. We take the prior year's liability and we predict what it's going to be, and we compare, and we'll have gains and losses, and we'll look into why that occurred and explain, well, we saw more retirements or fewer terminations than expected, whatever the case may be. That was enough about gains and losses. Matt's going to define a few key things before we get into results and how to interpret those.
Yeah, so after we go through the assets and liabilities, it's starting to prepare the meat of the report, your unfunded liability, your funding status, and Mike's going to talk about contributions here shortly. So Mike talked about the liability earlier. It's the amount of the benefit earned to date. So that's your liability. We want to determine the portion of that liability that is not funded by the assets, which is called your unfunded accrued liability. When we calculate the unfunded accrued liability, I discussed earlier that we use the actual value of assets versus the market value. So whatever portion of the liabilities that the assets do not cover, that's your unfunded accrued liability. Mike's going to talk about how that ties into the contributions. But we basically have this unfunded accrued liability that we want to pay off over a certain period of time and eventually get to zero. That's the ultimate goal of the plan. Because whenever you get this unfunded accrued liability to zero, you're basically your liabilities and assets equal, or you have enough assets to cover your liabilities plus somewhere you have a surplus. That's when your plan's at 100% funded. And 100% funded basically means you have your assets over liabilities are equal. So funding status, we look at it on a funding percentage basis. It's also known as a funded ratio. So on an asset standpoint, we do similar to the unfunded accrued liability. We use the actual value of assets. So your actual value of assets over your liability. And we'll see how the plan is currently, I think around 73% funded in the plan. Like I said, that ultimate goal is to get the plan up to 100% funded. Once you are 100% funded, I think Mike actually mentioned this earlier, you don't just stop contributing to the plan. You have that normal cost where it's that for the active participants of what they're going to accrue over this upcoming year that the plan's going to have to continue to contribute to keep that 100% spot. Another important thing for the plan is in order for the amortization to be paid off in a timely manner to get to that 100% funded, it's important for the plan to contribute on a timely basis. So the actual determined contribution being contributed actually to the plan. Anything less than that would delay the plan getting to 100% funded. Same thing on the investment standpoint, where if the plan doesn't achieve that 7%, it's going to take a little bit longer than we anticipate because your assets are not going to keep up with your liabilities. When calculating the funding status and liabilities, there are different measurements. As I mentioned earlier, from the asset standpoint, we use the actual value of assets with the market value. And then from the liability standpoint, I'm not going to get into the exact method, but we use the entry H normal method, which lines up with the GASB accounting standards. Jumping to slide 42, just kind of a picture of how exactly the unfunded accrued liability is. It's your benefits earned to date minus your assets. That's your unfunded accrued liability. Slide 43 gets into another picture of basically how it is. It's a fraction, essentially. It's your assets over liabilities. Now, in the report, Mike can go ahead and actually jump to slide 44. We show it on an actual value basis. Last year, the plan did reset their actual value of assets to market value. Like I said, this year we'll start smoothing in the gains and losses moving forward over a 5-year period. So right here, we see the funding ratio as 73.7% as of 2022. Now, fast forward to this year, we probably will show the plan on a market value of asset basis as well, maybe not necessarily in the report, but it's good information for the board that depending moving forward, the market value of assets is actually the true point of where the plan is currently at. But like I said, it's very volatile if they would use it on a market value basis, which is why we use the actual value of asset basis. So unless the plan contributes more or has higher than expected investment returns over the upcoming year, that actual value of assets will continue to get closer to that market value as we smooth in this expected loss over this upcoming year. Now, on an unfunded accrued liability basis, you can see here that our actual accrued liability was $1.27 billion. Our assets were $943 million. Take the difference between those two, that's your $336 million of unfunded accrued liability. And Mike's going to discuss how we calculate the contributions and how that $336 million plays into the actual determined contribution. So what exactly is an actual determined contribution?
Okay, so the rest of this presentation, we're going to talk about, we've talked tons about assets and liabilities and how they move and change, but we're going to talk about the contribution requirements. I think we have some asset smoothing, talked about gains and losses, but we're going to kind of talk about funding, amortization, and some other concepts around contribution requirements. So to do that, before we start, we've had this 2 or 3 times already in different formats. but this is that balance equation that has to match. We're going to focus on the contributions, but again, whatever contributions, this is member and employer, we're mainly focused on employer contributions requirements. But the contributions plus that investment return always have to be enough in the long term to cover benefit payments and expenses. So in order to understand the actuarial viewpoint of what the actuary thinks the contribution should be, it's a key part of the valuation. We need to define a couple of things. One is the actuarially determined contribution, the ADC. And then it looks very similar to the next one, actuarially determined employer contribution. So the actuarially determined employer contribution is determined in this box here. And the first component of that is we take the normal cost. We've talked about that. It's the cost of the employee working another year. They grew their retirement benefit because they have another year of service. They maybe got a pay increase and they're closer to retirement. So that's the normal cost that we have to pay. Amortization is the unfunded. We have that unfunded liability of 336 million, I think it was. And we have to pay for that. And the method to pay for that is a 15-year amortization of that unfunded liability. And so think of the unfunded liability as being the what's unfunded. We have to pay for it like it's a house that we just bought. And we have to amortize and pay for that over a 15-year period. And so that amortization is the payment schedule for paying that down over 15 years. So every year we have unfunded liabilities, we're going to have this extra payment to pay until we pay off the house. So the normal cost is the extra year of payment, or is the 1 year of service that we earned. And then we have to pay down our unfunded to get us closer to 100% funded by paying an amortization payment. From that, we make an interest adjustment just to get the timing of the contributions to match the payroll timing. When we add that up, that's the total. That's kind of a gross actuarially determined contribution. And we convert that to dollars amounts and percents of pay. But from that, we subtract out employee contributions. And this is where we get the actuarially determined employer contribution. We take the total contribution needed, but we have minus the employee contribution rates, which are generally, there's a great people that are paying a little less, but eventually everyone's going to be paying 9% of their pay, all members. So the value of those employee contributions expected for the upcoming year is subtracted from what we need the employers to contribute, so that the employers and the members are paying the full cost of the plan. So this is how we put it all together in the actuarial report, which will update to 2023, but it's a good example of, to use for all the concepts we learned and how it all comes together. For each of the data that we collected and members that we collected, active members, people that are in pay, terminated members, and those non-vested terms, we calculate the present value of their future benefits, and then we figure out how much of that has been accrued to date. For actives, it's the full amount. Once they retire or terminate, then the full amount of their expected benefits are already accrued. But for actives, this is just the accrued portion that they've earned to date. And that gets us that actuarial liability of 1.28 billion that Matt talked about. And then we subtract out that asset. So this is all in the report what Matt reviewed. The actuarial value of assets, which was reset to market value, but it's 943, and we get that unfunded liability, and that's what I called the value of the house that we need to pay off is 337 million, almost 337 million. Again, the funded ratio is the assets divided by the liability. So all that we already talked about is at the top, and from the rest of this in the report is how we calculate the numbers that go into the calculation of the actuarially determined employer contribution. And that's the normal cost to pay for the additional year of service for actives, the came to 21.6 million. And we made like I said, we made an adjustment to the middle of the year to get it to line up with payroll. It goes to 22.3. That's the amount should be pretty stable now that we've gotten through an experience study. It may fluctuate a bit, but that's the normal cost that should be paid every year. The amortization of a payment for the 336 that we need to pay, we're gonna have to pay 34.5 million, with interest is 35.7 million. This amount's gonna go up quite a bit next year, probably in the next few years, due to the 2022 earnings losses and bad investment experience that everyone had, not just your system, during 2022. We're gonna have a bigger unfunded liability, and so this payment is going to increase above 35.7. So the number, the 22 million and the 36 million, I'm sorry, add up to the actual determined contribution that I talked about, 58 million. From that, we get to subtract out what's the payroll times that 9% employee contribution or member contribution rate. We get 21 million. So of the 58 million, 21 million is going to be paid by members, and then that leaves 37 million to be paid by the employers. Okay, so that's all actuarially determined contributions. Keep that in mind. Any questions about that before we move on? Good, I think we hit that one pretty hard. This one I won't get into too much, but we do split the employer contribution into the pieces, the different employers, the board, the retirement system staff, and the charter schools, and allocate the different amounts of normal cost, accrued liability, and member contributions to get their employer contributions as a dollar amount. Then we divide by their covered payroll, but this 14.8% is really how we allocate it. Everybody pays the same would pay, or we're saying that they should pay. All the employers should pay the same percentage. But the key thing about difference in this plan in your system than some is that what actual contributions that the employers are going to pay are not based on what the actuary says. They're based on statutory requirements. So now we have to add this new concept, which is a little simpler to understand, but it's basically right now for 2023 is 14. I think it's 2023 is 14%. Look at my note. 2023, it's going down to 13.5. So this was 2022's rate, but there's a 1 year delay. So, but this employer contribution of 14% is something in statute, and it's going to decrease 0.5% every year until it gets to 9%. So that at the end of the time, based on current statutes in 2032, the members and the employers are going to be paying 9% into the system. And the reason we want to point this out is just to let you know that this year we said the actuary says we need 14.3%. Well, we're getting 14%. That's not that big of a difference, but that small difference is going to be a reason why the plan is going to be a little less funded than it otherwise would have been if we gotten the full 14.28%. When that goes down to 13.5% next year, and we show up in June and say this number is higher because we think it will be, because the assets, probably lost 10 to 12% last year on a market value basis. Over the next 3 or 4 years, there's going to be upward pressure on this. This is going to be increasing probably over the next 3 or 4 years while we bring those losses in, and this number is going to be going down 0.5% per year. So this gap is going to widen. And that's going to cause, some, they're known issues or risks to the system, but they are going to cause a widening gap and perhaps an increasing unfunded amount. It's something important for the board to understand, that even though the actuary is saying this is the amount, it's defined in statute a different amount. I think I was going to show one more slide that's not in the deck, if it's okay. I just wanted to be clear on that, if it's okay. I pulled this a summary from a different project we did, but I just wanted to make it clear, like the employer's contributions have been decreasing 0.5% for a long time, and they will bottom out in 2032 at 9%. On similar note, members hired prior to 2018 were paying 5.5%, and they increased to 9% in 2025. So now by 2025, everyone will be paying, all members will be paying 9%. And if nothing changes, the contributions coming in will be equal at 9% for the employer and 9% for the members in 2032 and later. So I just wanted to reemphasize that.
A question, Mike.
Sure.
We are currently, I guess, in negotiations to get the board to cap at 14% instead of going all the way down to 9%. We started the 0.5% every January since 2018.
Mm-hmm.
How will that impact if, in fact, we cap at 14, get the board to cap at 14 instead of going to 9? Will that significantly help us in terms of funding, and if so, how much?
If it stops at 14 alone, it's hard to say. It definitely will be way better than it would have been if we go down the path to go all the way down to 9%. It's hard to quantify. It won't change any of the numbers in our valuation as far as what we say should be going forward, except for every year we come, when we come in January 2024 and we received 14% instead of 13.5%, we'll just be that much better funded, right? And we'll be able to, in the long term, I suspect that shoring it up at 14% is a good idea. Another proposal that I know has been kicked around and we would recommend would be, if you could get it passed, would be to say, okay, let's cap it at 14%. But if the actuary says you need to put in 15.5% in a given year, that we get 15.5%. But I know that's a lot. There's political pressures and budgets and everything else. So it would be a good first step to freeze that at 14% for sure.
Okay.
I don't know. Sue, do you have anything else to add about anything we said, or I didn't want to give you opportunity if you have any more detail.
No, I think this was good. One thing I think, don't we track in the report, because we have those two different tiers of members that are contributing at different rates? Haven't we started tracking that in the valuation report so we kind of know how many are at which tier?
Yeah, I think we put that in.
Yeah, I know we break it out by payroll, and we don't show it here, but I'm pretty sure in the report we do break out payroll and by counts. It should be in right there.
Yeah, I saw tier. There we go.
Okay, yeah, we started tracking how much dollars for each.
Yeah.
So we have a group of the ones that are higher is a growing amount, but we're right. Yeah, we're tracking that separate.
And so I know that goes into the calculation. I don't know if as that number more people get, because right now everybody's at the people hired prior to 2018 are at 8%. So we're almost to the point where everybody's going to be at 9%. I don't know if that will help in the calculation at all.
It helps a little because this group, this 156 million of payroll, it's a decreasing amount because some of them retired or whatever, but they're getting 1% more over the next 2 years than they would have otherwise. So it's, every dollar counts. That's about $2 or $3 million more going into the plan than otherwise would have. It's not, this expected contribution is based on their current payment rate, not the 9%, for that group, but next year it'll be 0.5% higher and then 0.5% higher. So yeah, it definitely will help offset some of the pressure on the employers, but not hugely. It's not a cosmic shift, but it is helpful.
Yeah. And then kind of going along with that, the board recently approved that change in the interest rate where we were at 5%, and then starting, we credit the end of this year, it's going to be 2%. what impact does that have on our funding?
It decreases the liabilities a little bit, because we project out, what somebody might get when they terminate employment. We project out a lower interest rate. But it's not a huge, it's definitely a help, but it's similar to the other change I talked about. It's not the game changing move that we would want, but
Right.
every little bit helps, I guess.
Yeah, but it's a piece of the puzzle, huh?
It's a piece of the puzzle.
All right. If any of the other trustees have any questions or comments? I know it's a lot of information.
Yeah, but it was very well presented, and I really enjoyed. You made it very simplistic, so I could understand it, and that's what I've always admired about you, Mike and Matt. You all do an excellent job of presenting complex information in a very easy manner, so it's easy to digest.
It was a great presentation, but when will we receive this? Because your font on this presentation was just a little too tiny for me.
Yeah, I'll send it out tomorrow. Doris, would you like me to print it and send it to you? Because I know you do keep your folder.
Yes.
I'll send it by email, and I'm happy any of the other trustees want it printed. I'm happy to send you a printed version as well.
Mhm.
So just let me know.
That would be great.
That'd be-
I'll join the club with that one.
Okay. All right, we'll do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And Lewis, I have
Anything
noted
else?
your disability question as well. I will follow up.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that, Mike. And I just kind of wondered, because I know that's a speculative thing. It usually, from what you were saying, it doesn't usually happen. But I was just wondering how that impacts on someone who's only been in the system, and you can't calculate based on 10 years and consecutive and all that stuff, because they haven't been in it that long. How does that impact on them? I was just wondering.
Yep.
But, I mean, I answer that some, but so I think in your example, if someone was here for 7 years, you could just look at that 7-year period and your highest 3 years over that 7-year period.
Oh, I see.
That would be your clearing. There are instances where we see someone come into the system at age 64, and they automatically, I believe, even after 1 year, they're technically vested at age 65. You only look over at a 1-year period to calculate the final average monthly earnings, so that someone could technically go out with 1 year of service if they come into the system at around age 65. So it's basically look at that period, but if it's longer than 10-year period, we only look at a 10-year period.
Okay.
Are people retiring earlier or are they retiring later?
Yeah, I don't know, Matt, you can weigh in here, but I think I'm seeing kind of a split group, people that retire when they can, early with the intention of working someplace else. And then we have the other group that, they like what they do and they're going to stay in their job. So, they're going to wait till they're 65 plus to retire.
Okay.
Yeah. And Mike, I don't know if you have the experience study open or not, but I think we break it down of people who are roll of 80 versus who are not roll of 80, because there are different trends on depending where people, and that kind of ties into your comments too. Like people that hit roll of 80, you might hit unreduced at age 50 or 55. And if you maxed out your years of service, they might convince their benefit and go somewhere else and kind of double dip in a way and possibly have another pension benefit they're earning.
Okay.
Yeah, and we had a few people last year that were retired, came out of retirement to teach either the same school or a different school, maybe stayed a year or two, and then that added to their additional benefit as well.
Hello?
Sheila?
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear.
What about when you have interrupted service? You work and you leave and then you come back. How is that calculated? I'm talking about somebody leave at the age of 45 and then they come back at the age of 50. Do you start all over? How does that work?
I believe you just have a break in service where you just don't get service during that period. So if they had 20 years of service at age 45, you leave for 5 years and not back, you just start accruing service from there.
Yeah, and I would just add that that would be true as long as they didn't take a refund of their contributions. If they decided to take any money they had contributed, then they would start over again unless they purchased the service back. And we have very few purchase of services, maybe 2 or 3 a year. There's not very many, but some folks left and came back. Others work someplace else and they want to apply that service to their time here.
Okay.
Okay. Any more questions? Well, gentlemen, is that it?
We're good. We appreciate the time.
Yeah, and I think whenever we're finished, we just need a motion to adjourn.
Okay. And since we're finished here, may I have to get a motion to adjourn?
I would like to make a motion for adjournment and thank you, Matt and Mike, for your presentation.
Second.
Okay. A roll call, Sue?
We can just do this one by acclamation. So all in favor.
Okay.
Aye.
Aye.
There's no nays. Any nays?
No, definitely. Days to- Okay. Okay.
Thank you all.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you all very
Okay,
much.
bye, everybody.
Materials out.
All right.
Evening.
All right.